Measure vertical dimension.
From the rest.
Right
Say
here.
Emma and see where he's at.
What about posterior? So we can measure it anteriorly. What about posterior? So let me paint this scenario. So you have a patient that has all this wear in the front teeth. The teeth are worn down. Not much wear on the posterior teeth. Did the patient lose vertical?
I had a professor in school say most of these cases patients haven't lost vertical dimension and always confused me. I never understood why.
Yeah.
Well, if their posterior teeth haven't really worn, then they probably haven't lost vertical because it's your posterior teeth that are maintaining that for the most part.
Because we got there's kind of three verticals. You know, you got this.
Then how is that interdental papilla so close to that other tooth down there?
That's, I'm glad you said that.
All right. It sure looks like he's lost vertical.
Yeah, it does, and that's where these kind of cases can burn you, okay? Because I want you to pay attention to.
I've just been treating them my whole life as if they lost vertical,
Yeah.
just open them up anyway.
Yeah, but
Right.
but here's why a case like this, you'll get burned if you do that. Okay, so you look at this guy and it's easy to go, oh dang, he's worn his teeth, he's lost a lot of vertical dimension. But that's his lip at rest. Does he have an adequate amount of incisor display? No?
For his age.
For his age, that's pretty normal, isn't it?
No. He
No.
doesn't have any, he's like,
You don't show
they're
it.
short. But what about his lower incisors?
They're about right.
They're okay.
They're too long. In my mind, look at them. They're sticking up. You know, they should be a little more along this lower lip, somewhere right in there, and look where they're at.
Right.
So if we were to come in and say, oh, he's lost vertical, and go, oh, he needs a longer tooth, and so we lengthen his tooth, what are we going to have to do with him?
Open.
Open his bite.
Yeah.
What's that going to do to that?
Make it look longer.
Yeah.
Will that really matter though? Don't you have to put crowns on those things anyway? You have to. What are you gonna do with those things?
What you're saying is don't do build-ups there, leave the crown heights right at the height that those teeth are at, or you might have to reduce those when you prep those?
Crown lengthening everyone.
I want to see what you guys got. Let's throw it out here.
Well,
This
right
is a-
now we're
this
seeing
is a
lower
good
teeth.
discussion.
We're seeing lower teeth, but if we got his upper teeth longer, they're going to overlap, and you're not going to notice that the same way.
I'll tell you what. I restored him, and I opened his bite less than 1 millimeter.
So you drop the lower incisors and increase the uppers.
So the
That right there tells the story.
Those are super erupted.
So when the patient wears, this is called wear and super eruption. So as this tooth wears, or the linguals of this wears and these erupt,
Right.
the soft tissue and the alveolus erupt with it. So the patient maintains their vertical, but the teeth are worn out. So we come in and we go, oh, they've lost vertical, and we go, we need to open them up. And then that's one of the problems I have with like an LVI type philosophy where they'll just go and do the Shimbashi measurement and go, oh, the measure here, we need to open them up. If you did that with this guy, okay, and you opened him up and you lengthen this tooth like this, he would walk around and look like a different species, right? It just doesn't fit his face. And so this kind of comes back into this facially generated treatment plan. And so what has to happen, these have to come down. So how do they come down?
So that's where you did your crown lengthening, is on his
You
lower?
could intrude them. You could orthodontically intrude them, right? Band them up and then push these down. And then after you push them down, you can just build them up a little
Might be
bit.
tough to get a bracket on that molar back
Yeah.
there.
Or what we did is we just kind of lengthened this guy. So what I would do in a case like this is I would go in and first thing I would do is I would go in his mouth and I would take some composite and I would do a mock-up on the incisal edge of this tooth. Just freehand mock it up, just like I'm building an edge. Sit him up, smile for me, Bruce. Okay, say M, and now I'm going to look to give it that ideal position of his tooth, right? I'm not even worried about all this yet. I'm just saying, where does this front tooth need to be in his face? Mock it up. Okay, so I'm going to make that mock-up. I usually just start with one tooth. That way I can just look and see, and then when I get it, then I may match the other one. Take an impression of that and tell the technician, this is the length of the central incisors. And then they wax everything else around that. Now the question is, what comes next? It's the vertical It's all the other stuff. Does that make sense? So this is why the photos and the face is important, because if you come in, open this guy's bite and raise him up, you can only walk around like this. It's gonna be too open vertically. And Pete Dawson will tell you that, if you read his book, he'll tell you if you open a patient like this, they're just gonna pound it back in. That the vertical is determined by the masseter muscle.
Are you giving your lab tech creative freedom with the crown shape form?
Yeah, for the most part. The other thing I'll do sometimes, if I'm making alterations to the soft tissue, I'll go in here and I'll draw on there where I want it. So I'll know with this, maybe this is gonna come down a millimeter, or maybe it's gonna stay where it is. But I need to draw this, so I'll draw on the stone model, and then I'll make a suck down, and I'll basically create a guide for the surgeon to put, or myself, whoever's doing it, to put it on the teeth, and that becomes a reference. So if I'm going to have the tissue be right here, you know, right there, they know that they're going to have to take that bone 3 millimeters apical to wherever I want that gingival margin to be. Does that make sense? We got to have that 3 millimeters.
Did you discuss with them about a hybrid as another option? Or like, rather than going through all the crown lines and things?
We probably did, because I was doing hybrids at this time. But in his case, taking out, you know, all the teeth, I think he decided he wanted to save his teeth. Because there's his x-rays.
Really not periodontally involved.
I can tell you, these teeth are some of the most solid. I mean, these would be hard teeth to extract. These are those teeth that are like concrete in there. I mean, they're full of bone. You could place implants in this guy. I don't even think you'd have to look in there. You just feel it and go, there it is. I mean, that's how much width the guy had. It's a no-brainer. So, treatment plan complex cases, one must understand how to determine the correct tooth position and in which order. So again, central incisor, mocking that up, knowing where that position is going to be, okay? And you already know how. So if I brought a patient to you and this patient had no front teeth, and I said, hey, we need to put front teeth in this guy, what would you do? I bring a guy in your office, you've never seen him, and he's a dentulist.
Impressions, wax rims.
Yeah.
Just start checking your vertical on your rims.
Okay, but where are you going to start the process?
Make a wax rim.
Makes a wax rim, but we're going to start putting teeth. Where are you going to start?
They start from the central north or that.
I just make sure I can see a little bit of that rim
Yeah,
sticking
so
down right.
that's my question.
Position, right?
What tooth do you start with?
8, 9.
8, 9. I
Okay.
would say M9.
Well, why don't you start with posterior molars?
Just can't see it back there.
Why don't you start with the lower incisors?
Facial degenerative.
Because the central incisor is the only tooth in the face that we have a reference for. Think about it. It's the only tooth that we have a reference to work from. So when we were taught dentures, they taught us to set the central incisors because we have a reference for the face to the lip, and then that's determined. This is the same process. This is like doing dentures. So if you know how to do a denture setup, you can do a rehab, you can do a hybrid, you can do any kind of this stuff because it's the same concepts. Central incisors go in. Once that's determined, then the laterals, then the maxillaries, and then we've got to determine now vertical position for the slower. And then the last ones are easy. The molars just drop in place. So here's the sequence: maxillary centrals, laterals and canines, maxillary posteriors, then the mandibular incisors. Set the vertical as needed at this, right? Because I think what some people do is they just go, oh, I think he's lost 2 millimeters, they'll open the pin and they'll set everything to that. I come in and I say, where do these central incisors belong in the face? Set those. Then I set the other teeth around them, following the smile line, the aesthetic position. Put maxillary posterior, so I've got that plane of occlusion. Now these go in. And what vertical that goes at is basically going to be determined of where I need them to be, right?
Are you setting your own teeth on your wax rims?
Sometimes.
Someone an intro?
Sometimes weird. I like doing it once in a while.
How are
We
you?
knew you were weird.
How are you
But
arranging
yeah,
it?
that's a
In a
given.
case like Bruce's, how do you arrange that? Are you doing
The
any
lab.
surveys, or they're just
So
like-
I would, in a case like Bruce, and I think I have them on here, this is how I do it. Okay? So I can communicate with the technician. I draw on the photos and say, hey, this is what we want to do, this is the length we're going to do. Okay? And in his case, we're going to length the teeth gingerly. So I may have the technician actually do a wax up, carve this back and wax up there. And then now the surgeon gets that template, puts it in, takes his knife and goes, right, lays a flap, and then measures the bone from this 0.3 millimeters.
What's
This
your,
tooth came out, by the way. That one was not workable.
So you crown lengthen the upper here,
Upper and lowers. Crown length in here, crown length in there.
because they both super erupted in as well.
Yeah. So basically, this is where he's at, and that's where he wanted to be, and that's the difference. Make sense?
are you in 9 to 12 weeks for that healing and crown lengthening, or were you usually?
The crown, you know, it's funny, because I was taught in school, we wait 8 or 12 weeks. I wait till there's a probable sulcus. Doesn't matter how long it is. The reason I know that, because I learned the hard way. I had a patient, I did crown lengthening on 10 teeth, did it myself. Flapped it, crown lengthened, beautiful case. I let it heal 8 to 12 weeks, somewhere in there. Everything looked good, so I thought. Went in, prepped the case, placed all my margins equigingival, or maybe half a millimeter subgingival, that's it. Bonded everything in, looked great. She came back on recall a year later, inflamed all the way across. Thought it was a hygiene problem. Worked with her on her hygiene, said, you know, we need you to do sulcular brushing, da-da-da. She does it everywhere else impeccable. Wherever my dentistry was, red and inflamed. What happened?
She never reattached. You give
Attached.
it time, you pack your cord down there, and you pour through
What I think happened is,
You didn't reduce enough, 3 millimeters?
she wasn't, the tissue wasn't ready, it hadn't formed a probable sulcus. So in other words, it was rebounding. So I come in and I put a margin, even though it's not buried, it's right there. I basically violated the biologic width. It'd be the equivalent of putting a crown margin. And it's like a guy like Bruce is a good example. These are the kind of patients, remember we talked about how do you predict who's going to recede and who's not going to recede? Bruce you're not going to have a problem with recession on Bruce. You're going to have a problem with tissue wanting to rebound and tissue wanting to grow back over the margins. So if I crown lengthen this, right, and I don't wait a long enough time to get a probable sulcus, I could put that margin right there, perfect at the tissue, and he's going to have red inflamed gums because I violated the attachment. Bizarre. But if he had a 4 millimeter sulcus, and then I put the margin, 2 millimeters subgingival, he's going to get recession and he's going to show the roots. So on my cases, when I'm prepping, I'm always probing, I sound the bone. So I'll after I got them done, I'll take my perio probe and I'll pop through the attachment. You can feel it. You can go through and you dink, 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 you hit on the bone, and I measure that right there. That way I know what my biologic width is specifically for that patient. And then I use that measurement to determine where I place the margin. That's a good way to predict whether you're going to get recession, because it sucks to have a case, everything looks pretty, and then a year later or 2 years later, they start creeping up, and now you've got like the margin exposed and all this root showing. To a pretty good extent, you can predict that by knowing what the biologic width or where that periodontal interface is, predicting it and placing your margin accordingly.
So you just want 3 millimeters from bone level where your margin goes. Is that what you're saying? A millimeter sulcus
Well,
and 2 millimeters attachment?
Yeah, that diagram,
3
that's the
millimeters.
biologic width, right?
Yeah.
That the body's going to maintain that. So if you have someone that has more than 1 millimeter sulcus, let's say they have a 4 millimeter sulcus, right? You could put that margin up into that sulcus all the way up to that 1 millimeter and be fine. So what I'm saying is, someone that's got a deep sulcus like that, you're going to want to put the margin deeper. But if it's shallow and they got a thick biotype like this, then that patient's going to have a tendency to rebound.
Or if it's shallow, as in if you probe it and it's 1 mil, then you want your margin pretty much right at equiginger.
Maybe 0.5, you don't want to, you got that 1 millimeter range to work in, because once you encroach that, once you hit that attachment, you're going to create an inflammatory response.
So how much subgingival would you place a margin if their sulcus depth is, I don't know, 4 millimeters?
Well, again, it would kind of depend on where I wanted the tooth length to be. But if it had a 4 millimeter sulcus depth, I may, depending on where I wanted the gingival levels to be when I was done, maybe I would gingivectomy that beforehand. Maybe I would carve the tissue and raise it. If I wasn't going to do that, I would probably drop the margin in somewhere between, that 1 and 3 millimeter range.
Okay.
But yeah, be careful for guys like Bruce because they'll rebound on you. So there's his implants. There's his Emax restorations. Okay. Decent result, I think. Pretty hard case, but.
That's amazing to me that you were able to do that without opening the bite.
I know.
That totally surprises me.
Yeah.
Crazy.
But so you have to go do crown, you have to do all the crown like thing to get that.
But not much posterior. It's all like, from here to here.
Yeah.
Because the posterior hadn't even lost vertical there.
Do you have a resting position photo of him now? Do you have one of this at rest?
I don't have
Just
it in this
wondering,
presentation, but I'm
you
sure.
can see a couple mils of his uppers now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's probably smart,
So we still had a posterior stop before.
yeah. And you can see one of the ways that I do the rehab, see this tooth, you can tell this is a buildup, but that one, that's an untouched tooth. You can almost see there's no wear on that tooth too.
Yeah.
But the way I do the rehabs is you'll notice the front 10 are done. So I often will do 10 over 10. So I rarely will I prep a whole arch. I may prep a whole arch, but at least on one arch I'm going to leave the molars unprepped. Lots of reasons I like doing that. It gives me a lot more control over the case. So when I'm doing a wax up, for example, I can have these back teeth that can index some type of carrier, i.e. a seal tag or a copyplast suck down matrix. And then the other thing that I like about it is it allows me to dial in the anterior disclusion and the guidance and the coupling and all that. And then I don't have posterior teeth to deal with. And it makes the rehab process really, really easy and predictable. Because once you have all this dialed in on the upper and lower, 10 over 10, these molars, it's just a matter of dropping them in. All they have to do is touch, get a centric spot, and then they're already going to, and just have to make sure the technician makes sure they get out of the way during excursions and you're done.